Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, the regulatory landscape, and capital markets. This segment is presented by Charles Schwab. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining us this afternoon, we have Dr. David Stuckenberg, President and COO of Genesis Systems, as well as Jason Dodier, co-founder and COO of Grain Ecosystem. We're here to discuss resilient climate infrastructure and the synergies between water technology and biochar deployment. It is great to have the both of you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks, and of course, September Climate Week NYC takes place the week of September 21st, and we're focusing on climate tech for the month of September. Dr. Stuckenberg, climate infrastructure, how do you view that as a whole when you think about it? I feel like climate tech, climate infrastructure can sometimes be used in multiple ways. How do you view it?
Well, I view it as a more or less a branding strategy, but more than that, I think more importantly, I view it as critical infrastructure. When we look at the way that food, water, and energy tie together in the nexus, these three things cannot be separated. And really what we're fundamentally talking about is conservation of resources, right? We live on this blue planet and we only have so much to go around, and we need to be wise stewards of it for the next generation. So fundamentally, to me, it is not a political issue, but an issue of stewardship.
Yeah, Jason, I think David brings up an excellent point where it's conservation of what we have now instead of trying to find the next big thing, or perhaps it's a combination of leveraging multiple technologies.
For me, it's always been, when we think of infrastructure, immediately we jump to water pipes, power plants, and transmission lines. But climate infrastructure at its core is broader. So the symptoms that reshape how we manage energy, water, waste, soil, and carbon, it really is what takes risk and inefficiency, drought and residue burning and landfill methane, and turns them into resilient assets. And that's why technologies like water from air and biochar belong in this category, because they not only convert fundamental stresses into durable solutions, safe water where none exists, and then stable carbon that can restore soils while delivering verifiable carbon removals at the same time.
Yeah, David, it's interesting to see the synergies here. I mean, you've noted almost 4.5 billion people are affected by water scarcity. All businesses depend on it. And, you know, we tend to think about rare earths and what's next there. Meanwhile, I mean, water, I think we take it for granted at times.
You're right, Jill. And I think there's actually discussion ongoing about classifying water as a rare earth element. If we think about it, outside the ice caps on this blue planet of ours, only about 1/4 of a single percentile is actually accessible fresh water. And the amount that we have is going, and ultimately becoming tougher to find and access. And we take right now, for example, in the lower 48 states, about 40% of our water supply from the ground, and that's unsustainable and expected to deplete in many areas over the next decade. So we really have to kind of jump to a new rung on the ladder and do something different if we're going to get a different result beyond scarcity.
Right. And so, David, tell us about the solutions that Genesis Systems is providing to help conserve this important resource.
Well, fundamentally, it is a step change in how we can address water scarcity. And so if you think about it, since antiquity, since the time of the Romans, we have had centralized water distribution systems, and they've worked well for us. But if you think about those systems, they disturb a lot of ground. There's very expensive pipelines, and they have to have a water source, such as a lake or a river or an aquifer. What we're doing is a little bit more fundamental in terms of a step change in technology. So think of it like what happened with Motorola or the wireless network, where we're actually using air as a medium of transport. And so what we actually are the first company that can do, and have been pioneering for the past 8 years, is how to transport water at utility scale through air and generate that at the point of need. And now we're doing that.
Yeah. Well, Jason, it's interesting because agriculture, I mean, it depends on water, it depends on healthy soil. So how do the solutions such as David was describing and biochar deployment, how in practice, how do those synergize?
Well, when I heard it was going to be doing this segment with David, I was thrilled, because these solutions are how we get away from wishful thinking. If you look at since 1970, the US economy has more than quadrupled while water withdrawals have stayed flat. So there's proof that efficiency can bend resource curves, but quality has become the new constraint. So a lot of the stuff that I'm working on is tied to PFAS, forever chemicals, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, industrial residues. So when you look at pairing biochar with a decentralized water supply, not only are you going to strengthen soils, boost moisture retention, cut irrigation demand, but we're able to capture legacy contaminants in filters and in field soil treatment. So if you think about what Genesis is doing with water cubes, we're changing the whole dynamic of the water from air equation. And the team there is using some of these advanced sorbents and technologies to capture humidity, much like what we're trying to do with these biochar projects, leveraging best-in-class pyrolysis and gasification to then be able to stack and make these projects investable and design them in a way where you drive resilience at the core and it's infrastructure that people can trust.
Right. And Jason, I'm glad you brought up the point of infrastructure, because at the end of the day, this is going to require public-private partnerships because of the fact that it takes place in local communities and the land and water that we all have to share. What do you think is missing in today's capital allocations, and what are policymakers missing for that matter?
And you and I have talked about this a little bit in the past, but the big one, and this is going to be a big focus during New York City Climate Week, is the blended finance as the bridge. I've talked a lot about concessional capital, climate funds, carbon-free purchases as well, that can take the first loss risk and crowd in the senior debt. So for us, that's a big part of the story. In addition is the development banks. We just did a project recently, actually in Kenya, in partnership with the World Bank and Habitat for Humanity, using biochar to concrete for affordable housing. But we need a better path from pilot to platform, and that's really important. We can obviously talk about some of the bigger name companies that are involved, but a lot of these DFIs, development banks, and larger enterprises and foundations are critical right now.
Yeah, and David, I'd like to get your perspective on that as well in terms of partnerships and how to execute on this.
Well, I had the privilege of actually sitting on a panel with Jay Heller in 2022 for the United Nations, and we talked during the first UN water conference in 46 years about the importance of water investment, and I think those conversations need to be ongoing in terms of finance. But I also think there were other elements that emerged that really are thematics that we need to break through on. Certainly, Genesis has already de-risked much of what it's doing, and we're, in 2025, we'll support 125,000 people around the world with our water cube, essentially air wells, and those folks will be, on the receiving end of health, hygiene, and hydration from, Africa to South America and North America. But I think really where we need to go is away from established and very entrenched paradigms. And so I'm the benefactor of a very special mentorship of one of the people who rolled out the earliest cellular network in the United States. And there was a tendency for the well-established and entrenched, Bell telephone companies, if you will, of that time to really resist bidding on the new frequencies that were being made available to establish these wireless networks. And what happened is that small enterprise came in and they began to take greater risk and realize that there was a business model here to develop. And I think that's the opportunity right now with water. As Jay has said, Jay Heller, the head of capital markets there at Nasdaq, water is the new Silicon Valley, and it's early. And so if we look at global water intelligence assessment of where water investment is going to go over the next decade, it will become, they predict, the number one investment theme, not number two, not number three, number one, growing from 12 trillion to 30 trillion over the next decade. And that's a simple reality at the base of that. Water is required for everything in the supply chain. It's the economic potential energy of a nation, and without it, you stop in 3 days. And so what we are able to do as a company is really come in and fortify corporations, public entities, and even governments, and say, here's a water supply that is uninterruptible. And we did that in Hurricane Milton last year by providing a backup water supply to the Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital. And as a result of that, they didn't have to evacuate that hospital. That is what's to come. And I think that's what we talk about when we're talking about resilience. It's the ability to take a hit and keep going. It's supply chain certainty.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Jason, because you could even apply that train of thought to industries across the board with technology emerging as quick as it is. I mean, you could even, it's a national security issue, and you need to integrate these small, nimble startups, the academic incubators, and scale that with government or larger corporations. I don't think it's no longer the story of us versus them or legacy players having the edge here.
No, and again, the way I approach the climate infrastructure portfolio, it's not going to be just solar panels, batteries, and transmission lines. You've got durable carbon removal plants. You've got distributed water systems, long duration, obviously microgrids. One thing I would want to highlight there, though, at the core of this, I believe, is going to be prosumers. So these are households and businesses that not only consume electricity, but also produce it and often generate more than they need through solar, wind, or storage systems, like a Tesla Powerwall as an example. And this could be a use case to power. We think about a Genesis solution, a 100-gallon solution as an example at the home. You can leverage this, and you can leverage models tied to net metering or feed-in tariffs, all this other stuff. So absolutely, biochar plants and water cubes belong right alongside the dialogue of solar storage transmission. But these are the elements that I look at when I think of the core of hardening these communities against shocks that David just highlighted. And I don't know if people have watched the recent series on Netflix around Hurricane Katrina, but that brings it back to reality of the fundamentals to resilience for any community across the country and around the world.
So, Jason, I want to get both of your outlooks here. We'll kick it off with you, but what do you want to leave policymakers and investor allocators with? It baffles me that either the messaging around water or biochar is either misunderstood, or why are these investments not being made? What hurdle needs to be overcome?
So I'll say two things. Leading the U.S. Biochar Coalition Markets Committee, I have spent a lot of time at the federal level and state level. I recently did a talk with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and for me, the biochar dialogue has been one I've seen policymakers come to the middle on, because you're reusing these resources to improve these communities. I think that this is the moment to build a new backbone for the 21st century economy, there's no doubt. And to your point in the thematic of the talk, we can't silo solutions or treat them as pilots. So with that said, they must be deployed at scale as interconnected, measurable, and bankable infrastructure. And it's going to require long-term policy certainty, blended finance stacks, which we talked about before, and then procurement commitments that de-risk pioneers. We started to see that with Congressman Paul Tonko leading the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act. It's bringing in the right stakeholders across public and private, so then we can really mobilize this money. I think the last thing I'll say is, I lived in Dubai for a number of years. COP28, 28 was in Dubai, I believe, and loss and damage fund and other things. So we need to improve the capital going to shovel-ready projects and ensure that these things are at the core architecture of these societies, because we need it to be more secure, more prosperous, and more resilient overall.
Yeah, and David, I'll ask the same of you as well, how we get that buy-in across the board.
Well, first and foremost, I think we have to recognize that water is fundamental to our national security and our economy. I would predict that over the next decade, we're going to see a drawdown, if not the conclusion, of the age of free water, where it's no longer really considered as a significant part of a business expense. I think that that's going to be, partly due to scarcity, but also demand. We see these things switching ends. Everything in our society has a water footprint. So if I look at an iPhone, for example, that's 3,500 gallons of water, right, to create that. That's the footprint for that item. If I stack 3 phones, it's 10,000 gallons. And as humanity reaches for a better quality of life, they're going to continue to put pressure on strained resources. So where we have to look to is a creative mindset that moves us away from paradigms of the past and to new things. And what we're seeing is certainly within the investor segment, a paucity of water companies or water technology companies that are actually coming up with new and bold ideas. We're fortunate to be one of the pace setters, if you will, for how to do utility scale water generation, and have partnered with the Department of Defense to de-risk that technology for the past 8 years. So when we go to market, everything we have is defensible technology. It's out in the marketplace, if you will, in the field, being used by Department of Defense. And now we're essentially dual using that and making that available to public. So the public-private partnerships that Jason has mentioned are critical to de-risking, but also being comfortable, getting investors comfortable with failure, much like Elon does with blowing up a rocket ship. We have a zombie fleet of prototypes that have broken or not worked, and we have learned through failure. One of my mentors is the former chief scientist at Lockheed, and he used to tell me, Dave, the value is in failure because that's where you learn. Yeah. And we have to understand that as investors. We have to understand that as market disruptors. Not so much that we're going to break everything that's already there, but there's a new paradigm developing in the water supply. That paradigm is decentralized water generated at the point of need and from a renewable source that's air that replenishes in about 10 minutes to 10 days when utilized. So it's a complete shift from centralization to decentralization. And as Jason has mentioned, there's going to be a lot of very interesting business models built off of that. What we're seeing is that we're already immediately competitive in many markets with city and municipal water And we have the added trust of being maybe even 100 times more pure than EPA standards. So it's water that people have a trust for because they have control over it. They generate it in their backyard. And that is, I think, what consumers are asking for in similar models like cell phones and things that we've seen migrate over the last couple decades.
And Jill, just to put the exclamation on that, David absolutely nailed it. Fundamental changes don't happen because they're virtuous. I mean, you make the right outcome, the profitable outcome, and that's the lens we've also approached the biochar space with as well. So it's really showing the underlying economics and then leading from the front there. So I couldn't have said it better myself than how David just addressed it.
Appreciate both of your insights. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jill.